The final item of business is members' business debate on motion 20197 in the name of Alec Rowley on a menu for changes report found wanting. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons. And I call on Alec Rowley to open the debate for around 7 minutes, please, Mr Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to begin by thanking those who supported my motion and paved the way for this debate tonight, and also the Labour Business Manager who gave me the time for the debate. I would also want to acknowledge the big lottery for making the funding available for this important piece of work, and Oxfam Scotland, Poverty Alliance, Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland and Nourish Scotland, who managed and oversaw the work. The project Menu for Change aims to reduce the need for emergency food aid by ensuring people across Scotland get the cash, rights and food they need before they are in crisis. In working with local groups and local people, the study found that food banks are not the long-term answer to food insecurity. Fundamentally, people need cash so that they can buy the food they need. This is a very important point, as I do worry that food banks are something that certainly my generation had only really encountered during the miners' strike, 84-85, but we are now in danger that they become part of everyday life in Britain. That is Britain, the 5th largest economy in the world. And while I think it is good that people continue to make donations to food banks, and many food banks right now are desperate for people to make donations, but we need to keep saying that food banks cannot become a way of life. People cannot depend on charity to feed themselves, and that through the system of governance that we have, if people pay their taxes and contribute to the general well-being of society. The study found that low and irregular wages, combined with social security systems that often fail to provide a basic safety net, are what push people into food insecurity. In this Parliament, we must recognise that we do not have many of the levers that can address these issues, and that makes it all the more frustrating given the result of last week's general election. It has also been a bit depressing given that much of the overarching political debate in Scotland remains focused on unionism and nationalism with an all-or-nothing approach. I do hope, therefore, that the organisations behind this work can, looking forward, support a positive approach and help provide the evidence to make the case for what can be done if we in this Parliament had control over more of the tools and levers to be able to tackle poverty. I say this in the absolute belief that the Johnson government will not only fail to address these issues, but will proactively make them worse. But in the meantime, while many of the levers for change we don't have, we certainly have some, and there is action that can be taken by the government and by others in Scotland. The study shows that the Scottish Welfare Fund is a crucial lifeline for those in crisis. However, it is clear that we need to see that fund strengthened. The Scottish Government needs to increase the investment in the fund and its administration. I also believe that there should be a summit of local and central government along with the third sector to discuss the many recommendations that come from this report, as it does highlight the need for more coordination and joined up work, particularly at the local level. I also believe that this work can lead to more work and a national strategy for tackling poverty. A national poverty strategy will not on its own tackle poverty, but it will set out what needs to happen, where responsibility lies, and give us a clearer picture of the direction we need to take here in Scotland. The organisations involved in this report state that the Scottish Child Payment is hugely welcome. However, take-up must be closely considered in its development. They also say a wider package of support should be introduced for households who will not be eligible for this new benefit. There are a number of key recommendations for the Scottish Government, and it would be good to hear the Cabinet Secretary comment on those recommendations. It would be good if we could have a debate in the first half of next year in government time, setting out where the government are with its approach to poverty. I would also, Presiding Officer, point to the 3 areas, Dundee, East Ayrshire and Fife, where the studies were carried out. In each case, there is suggestions and recommendations based on the work that was done, and in particular, the detailed engagement with local communities. As a Fife MSP, I certainly intend to make sure that the report on Fife is shared as widely as possible and that discussion takes place with all interested parties, including local politicians who can make changes as a direct result of this work. The organisations involved in this study have made clear that it is key to listening to those with real life experiences of food poverty and poverty in moving forward and making policy. I will conclude, therefore, with some of the views of those people. One person says, I went 3 days without food and literally I was close to collapsing on the street. Another, I'm worrying about things that I need to really worry about, like whether I'm going to eat today or whether I'm going to pay my bills tomorrow. It gets to that embarrassing point of dignity totally goes out the window. You know, because I felt suicidal more than I had hot dinners, and that's no joke. And finally, I think your stomach kinda gets used to it. That's not the type of society or the type of country that we want to live in. This report gives us an opportunity to come together, to work together and say that we will no longer accept poverty in Scotland and that we will work together to do what we can to change that. Thank you.
We move to the open debate and speeches of 4 minutes, please. Angela Constance to be followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to Alec Rowley for securing this debate tonight because it gives me the perfect opportunity to thank all of the West Lothian organisations who work all year round and not just at Christmas to alleviate food poverty. And tonight's debate also gives me the opportunity once again to state my support for enshrining the right to food in Scots law, because hunger in one of the richest countries in the world is indeed a crime. It's a moral crime and it's a crime in terms of international law. To be specific, Article 11 of the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, signed by the UK as far back as 1976. And our approach to ending food poverty should be based on a legal right to food, but we need to be clear about what that actually means and what it means in practice, because it means that the Scottish Government and all of our public bodies would have a duty to ensure access to adequate and affordable food, and that the Scottish Government would indeed, as would their agencies, be open to challenge within their existing powers. And that's a big ask of any government. It's an ask that we should step up to. But we also have to recognise that if we want legislation to mean something in practice, that there is much more work to do within government, across Civic Scotland and on a cross-party basis to ensure that our approach is resilient and robust across time. And as Alec Rowley has said, The Scottish Government at present does not have all the levers required to end food insecurity and poverty. And this was also recognised in published work, Ending Hunger Together, led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Johnston. And this, of course, is demonstrated by local experience. Between April and September this year, the West Lothian Food Bank distributed over 3,000 three-day emergency food parcels and provided a lifeline to over 1,000 West Lothian Wains, their busiest year to date. And demand is increasing due to rollout of universal credit. Specifically, the reasons for families seeking help from the West Lothian Food Bank is to do with low benefit. 38% of families are struggling because benefits are low. 19% are struggling because of delays in benefits, and 17% are struggling due to changes in benefits. And the bottom line is that lack of food is due to the lack of money. And some countries have the right to food in their constitutions. Germany calculates social security benefits on the basis of what is required to have a nutritious diet and a life with dignity. Dignity, well, that's an important word, given that we know that there are many people who would rather go hungry as opposed to seek help from a food bank. Therefore, the work done by other organisations in my constituency, such as the Veni in Knightsbridge, with their Good Food outlet on a Tuesday, which supports 50+ families, the Polbeth Community Hub with their community fridge and community shop, all of their work is imperative because it recognises that food is about community as well as consumption. And I'm very grateful to the Polbeth Hub for hosting an event that I supported along with the West Lothian Art Link, the fantastic Soul Sisters, a social enterprise from Glasgow, for the community cooking lesson that they led, where we all learned how to make Algerian mahajabs and Polish pierogies. And all of these local organisations, in addition to tackling hunger, are also reaching out to communities to reduce loneliness, to reduce isolation, to promote good mental health, to help people upskill and recognise the social value of food. Presiding Officer, if I can end by saying this morning I had the great privilege of meeting children from Addywell Primary School, my old primary school, which made me somewhat reminiscent and nostalgic. And I know much has changed in the community that I represent since I went to Addywell Primary School in the 70s. But rising hunger and rising poverty for our children is indeed our collective shame. And as we look forward to 2020, we should remember that poverty is not inevitable, that we can end it if we are determined to transform our collective shame into collective action.
Call Jeremy Balfour to be followed by Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank Alex Rowley for bringing forward this for debate this evening. Can I also thank him for highlighting the report and for the report as has been written and has come forward. I may not agree with everything that is within the report, but I think what it does do is allow us to take maybe a step back and see how do we look at these issues in the longer term and how do we solve them. And I agree with absolutely Mr Rowley that food banks cannot become normative within Scottish society. And we need to work across parties and we need policies which we will sometimes disagree on, but we need to think outside the box to make sure that we do move on from food banks and we do not become part of Scottish society. I also want to thank the third sector and charitable organisations for the work that they do to combat social injustices. I know here within Lothian of many organisations, food banks and others, which are seeking to help the most vulnerable in society. And they do that often with little budget to themselves and with little resources. And I think we should pay credit to the many organisations that are doing that. I think there is a challenge both for national government and for local government on how do we fund those organisations and how do we make sure that those local groups are getting the funding they need. And I think there is no magic answer. Like Mr Riley is a former councillor. These organisations often go even under the radar of local councillors, that they are working in such a local small area. And actually all they need is a small amount of money to make a massive difference. And I think that is a conversation we need to continue. I think one of the other issues that we need to look at, and the Social Security Committee are looking at it at the moment, is in regard to uptake of entitlement of benefits. There is literally millions of pounds within the system that is not being taken up by individuals across Scotland. And we as a committee hope to produce a report early next year on giving some kind of way forward collectively to help on that. Yeah.
Aileen Campbell.
I totally understand some of the issues that they're raising. However, I just wonder what the member does think about the manifesto that the Conservatives stood on, that said there will be a potentially 60-year high in child poverty if the UK government continues to proceed with the policies that they have in place and the cuts they intend to make. We can do what we can support the third sector. However, a lot of this is caused by the cuts that your party have made, and I wonder if with the time you have left, whether you might think about trying to work out how you might try and change that.
Jeremy Balfour.
Yeah, if I can, Cabinet Secretary, deal with that in just one moment. I do think we have to look at take-up. I don't think it is an easy answer. It was interesting, we visited as a committee Wester Hales and talked to many local organisations there. And even amongst local organisations, there wasn't a consensus necessarily about going forward. To take up the Cabinet Secretary's point, I do think we sometimes forget that the old welfare system wasn't working, that there was cross-party support, third-party support for a new system to be introduced. And I also I think it is clear on record that at least at the beginning, Universal Credit had support across the chamber at Westminster. I think one of the issues that people clearly point to is this 5-week waiting period. And what concerns me, Deputy Presiding Officer, is why people are not being taken advantage of the advance payments that are there at day one. And I do think we need to look at what other messages are we giving to people why they're not taking up these advance payments. There seems to be a misconception that you have to go within this period without having any money, and that is simply not the case. And anybody that faces that should, I think my time is almost gone, unfortunately.
If you like.
And I do think we need to make sure that people fully understand that they can get that advance payment at day one, and that will help them to get through that period. So I again thank Alex Rowley for this debate. I do think I want to finish with how I started, and that is to say we do need to make sure food banks are not here forever, and we need to work to make sure that they do go. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Elaine Smith, followed by Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too thank Alec Rowley for bringing this important debate to the Chamber today. And I also commend all the groups involved in A Menu for Change for the comprehensive report they've produced on food insecurity in Scotland, which is a completely unacceptable situation faced by too many in our society. Found wanting is a disturbing assessment of the current political and structural response to food insecurity, and it really is shameful that people in one of the most prosperous countries in the world, a country with a reputation for good food and drink, should have to choose between feeding themselves or their children, and that people who work in full-time jobs should have to resort to food banks. No one should be resorting to food banks, but it's actually also people who are full-time working. Nobody should be going hungry in a decent modern society. Food insecurity is caused by poverty or adverse circumstances, not by the lack of availability of food. The study was carried out, as we've heard, in Fife, East Ayrshire and Dundee, but the evidence will be familiar to members from constituencies and regions right across the country. In North Lanarkshire, over 27,000 food parcels were handed out last year. And the Basics Food Bank, which serves areas in North Lanarkshire and is based in Wishaw, saw a 28% rise in demand over that period. And I have to say to Jeremy Balfour that actually we know that many of the causes of the insecurity that people face are as a result of austerity, a political choice to inflict hardship on the most vulnerable, and a path on which the recently elected UK government seems set to continue. Ending the 5-week wait for universal credit and the 2-child limit, improving working conditions to raise the living wage and ending exploitative zero-hour contracts would make a real difference to those who are facing food insecurity. And we know that that won't be tackled by the Tories, and it is now therefore imperative that the Scottish Government does look at using every resource at their disposal, not just to mitigate the impact of those harsh policies, but to use all the powers of the Scottish Parliament to raise the living standards of those communities that are hardest hit by austerity. Presiding Officer, food banks can help those facing food insecurity. Of course they can, and we would all thank the volunteers that set them up and work in them. But they are a symptom of the problem, as emphasised by the Menu for Change report. As Alec Rowley said, real solutions rely on ensuring the resources for people to buy their own food. Crisis grants from the Scottish Welfare Fund continue to be a source of emergency income, and in many instances that allows people to buy food. But of those surveyed in the report, over 52% of the participants received at least one crisis grant, and it was mostly to cover the cost of food and electricity. Since the Found Wanting report was published in October, more recent Scottish Government statistics show that nearly 60,000 applications for the Scottish Welfare Fund crisis grants were made between April and June 2019, and that represents a 12% increase compared to the same quarter last year, and that nearly 33,000 crisis grants were awarded. Most of that expenditure was allocated for buying food, 60% of all payments, and that's a 29% increase from the same quarter last year. So there is increased demand for the crisis payments, but there's been no increase in the Welfare Fund budget itself. We need to look at that. The Menu for Change report concluded that the Welfare Fund must be increased to improve the fund's ability to reach all of those who need it, and the latest figures only reinforce that argument. And we should also remember the latest figures for the months of April to June. We can only expect the demand to be even higher in the winter months, and households are having to choose between fuel and food. We should also remember that failing to resolve food insecurity is more than just a problem, it is a breach of human rights. One of the key recommendations of a Menu for Change's report is that the Scottish Government should enshrine the right to food into law to give day-to-day effect of international human rights law in Scotland, and then inform and empower people around this right. There's significant support for that proposal in Scotland. The Scottish Food Coalition lodged a petition in the Parliament calling for this to be included in the Good Food Nation Bill, and during that consultation more than half of respondents called for the right of food to be enshrined in Scots law. And as I've said previously, Presiding Officer, I intend to consult shortly on a Members' Bill on securing the right to food as a means of further developing the consideration of how best to do this in Scots law. I'll just conclude with this. The UK Government's approach to human rights legislation was, and will no doubt continue to be, to perceive it as a burden and talk of the need for reform or abolition. The Scottish Parliament has the opportunity to show leadership in human rights, to take forward the recommendations of a Menu for Change, the Scottish Food Coalition and many other organisations and charities, and take meaningful action to ensure that no one in 21st century Scotland goes hungry. Thank you.
Alison Johnson, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I would very much like to thank Alex Rowley for bringing this debate to the Chamber. We in the Scottish Greens are hugely supportive of the work A Menu for Change has achieved, and I was particularly proud to chair a meeting on the Menu for Change, the project and its research and its impact in Parliament just 3 weeks ago. We already know that access to food is a fundamental right, and colleagues have highlighted that again this evening. I think that is something that we mustn't forget. It's a fundamental right, but so many people in our country aren't accessing food at the moment, or they're finding it particularly difficult. But the Found Wanting research is particularly valuable in the way that it has revealed the lived experience of people who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Food poverty, period poverty, fuel poverty, they are all poverty. They all have the same root cause, a lack of a sufficient and a secure income. I think when we speak about food poverty, we can sometimes almost be, it might suggest that there isn't enough food. There is more than enough food, but not everyone has enough money to be able to access that food. And food banks are simply not the answer. One thing I was pleased to hear Jeremy Balfour state is that food banks aren't the answer. They must not become normalised. And the reason I know that is I have had correspondence, as you will all have had, from constituents on this issue. And one letter from a disabled mum of 2, I will never forget it. I mean, she told me that the worst day that she'd ever yet lived was the day that she had to go to a food bank with her 2 children because she felt her dignity was being completely and utterly eroded. So while we all agree that we're very grateful that this emergency food aid exists, imagine in this wealthy country, in this century, we're relying on emergency food aid to feed some of our most vulnerable citizens. While we're all agreed that this literal lifeline is there in our communities for many people, it simply isn't the answer. We have to make sure that people have enough of an income to buy the food they want when they want it. So whether people are working, whether they're not working and needing the help of the social security system, or perhaps a combination of both, that income for too many people in this country is too low and it's too unpredictable. The report draws attention to the fact that our insecure labour market is a major driver of this food insecurity. For many of those in the study found wanting reports on a sudden loss of hours on a 0 hours contract, coming to the end of a temporary contract, and a lack of basic employment rights such as sick pay. You know, you're unwell, so you have no pay. They contribute to not being able to put meals on the table. The Found Wanting report is yet another of hundreds of reports that points to the vandalisation of our social security system as a major driver behind food insecurity. And for those studying, moving on to universal credit from work or other benefits and having to wait at least 5 weeks for a payment was a common trigger for severe food insecurity. Now, as much as Conservative members often point to them as a solution, and Mr Balfour did in this debate, the report makes clear that advance payments of universal credit are not always the answer. Participants in the study were reluctant to take out these payments because they had to be repaid. How can you repay a loan when you've hardly got any money and you're struggling to get by? You know, this does put people off. Deductions on subsequent payments to pay back advances, rent arrears and other debts often extended the experience of food insecurity as incomes are simply insufficient to cover basic needs. I think it was Angela Constant made the point that Germany bases its social security model on whether or not people have enough money to buy good, nutritious food. We absolutely need a minimum income standard below which we can't expect anyone to survive or to be able to play a fulsome, normal part in society. And the report also draws attention to the role played by the Scottish Welfare Fund. In the cases of many people who took part in the study, the Welfare Fund was a true lifeline when people had simply run entirely out of money. But the report also notes that many people reach the number of grants they're entitled to access through that fund and then they're turned away. So we need to revisit whether a limit is appropriate and at the very least ensure that people are referred on to the sources of support and not simply refused with no other help or advice. The report suggests that this is happening in some cases. I know that I'm over time, presiding officer, so I will wrap up. I would be grateful. I proposed an amendment recently asking that the Scottish Welfare Fund be reviewed to ensure that it is adequate. I didn't get the support on that date from the Conservatives or the Government, but I'd be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could indicate whether that's something she would be willing to look at again. Thank you very much.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I would also like at the outset to congratulate Alex Riley on securing this important members' debate this evening. And I would also wish to commend Oxfam Scotland, the Poverty Alliance, the Child Poverty Action Group and Nourish Scotland for the excellent work they carried out in producing their longitudinal study, culminating in the report, the Menu for Change's report, Found Wanting. This report was published in October this year and makes for very stark reading indeed. The key issue that the report deals with is, as has been said, food insecurity. And it does so by being mindful of the individual stories involved in the areas of Fife, Dundee and East Ayrshire covered by the report, of the lives affected by food insecurity and of how circumstances can indeed change over time with a sudden need for individuals to seek recourse to emergency food aid in the form of food banks. And can I say, Presiding Officer, as the MSP for Cowdenbeath constituency, that the poverty we see in my constituency and right across Scotland, indeed energy-rich Scotland, is absolutely unacceptable. And whilst absolutely cross-party working and commissions and studies and meetings are all very well and good, I think nonetheless we must deal with the elephant in the room. And that, of course, is that the only way that we can tackle decade upon decade of systematic Westminster neglect and the generational poverty that we see as a result is to secure the normal powers of an independent country. For at the present time, we will always be constrained in what we can do for so long as, for example, 85% of social security spend is controlled by Westminster, for so long as full taxation powers are retained at Westminster, for so long as employment law is controlled by Westminster. Key levers that other normal independent countries would take for granted. Yes, the SNP government is taking action to the full in terms of the powers that it has. It is straining every sinew to tackle the poverty we see around us in our country. And of course, the SNP Scottish Government will continue to do that day in and day out. And witness in that regard the Scottish Child Payment, described indeed by one of the authors of this report, the Child Poverty Action Group, as a game changer in shifting the poverty curve. Witness the Scottish Government's putting fairness, dignity and respect at the heart of the limited social security powers that we have in this Parliament. Witness the SNP Scottish Government legislating for free school meals for primaries 1 to 3, for help with school uniforms, for the carers supplement, for the Best Start grant, for free prescriptions, to name but just a few. And of course, in the area of employment, we see the SNP Scottish Government's commitment to promoting fair work to the extent that it can with the powers that it has. As far as the Scottish Welfare Fund is concerned, which I note has been mentioned by a few speakers, my understanding is that the Scottish Government has asked COSLA to indeed have a look at the operation of the same. But what we must say, Presiding Officer, is we simply do not have the power to end Tory austerity and to stop the welfare cuts. We only have the power to mitigate against these. And indeed, the Scottish Government is spending about £100 million per annum on mitigating the worst excesses of policies that we in Scotland don't support, implemented by a UK government that we in Scotland did not vote for. But presumably, Presiding Officer, that cannot be the sum total of our ambition in this Parliament, simply to mitigate against the damaging policies of others, nor indeed is such an approach sustainable. For we will not solve the generational poverty we see in our country, nor tackle the food insecurity facing far too many individuals and families in the current constitutional settlement. And indeed, we will not solve these problems by spending and allowing to be spent in our name £200 billion on nuclear submarine replacement. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the only way that we will tackle these problems, the structural problems, is to see the return of normal powers of independence to this Parliament. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, I want to congratulate Alec Rowley for securing this debate tonight. Our government's National Performance Framework aligns with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the second of which is to achieve zero hunger globally by 2030, ensuring access by all people, particularly those in poverty and vulnerable situations, to safe, nutritious and sufficient food all year round. And as colleagues have passionately argued tonight, so far this goal is far from being achieved in Scotland. In the 6 months between April and September of this year, the Trussell Trust distributed over 100,000 three-day food parcels in Scotland. And the Trust has said that on average, people who accessed food banks in 2018-19 needed around 2 referrals each. That's 6 days' worth of food, or rather 6 days a person or a family might have had to go without. And the Menu for Change Found Wanting report highlighted the extreme resilience of people living the reality of food insecurity across Fife, East Ayrshire and Dundee. And sadly, their experiences are echoed right across the country. And fundamentally, what the report showed is that people experiencing food insecurity need access to cash, not just for a crisis, but cash so that they can access food throughout their lives. And that's why the report's recommendations on the Scottish Welfare Fund budget are so important, because the fund has been vital in enabling people to survive. The flexibility it allows local authorities to adapt the funding to the needs of their region is also important. But more needs to be done to access the barriers to get access into this fund, as a limit on how many payments can be made, excessive requirements to provide evidence of financial difficulties, and understaffed administration are leaving people waiting. And these problems have put people off accessing this vital grant. So if we are to address the principles of dignity and respect that are ingrained in the delivery of the Scottish Welfare Fund, we need to make sure that its budget increases, as does awareness and knowledge of what the fund can do as well with the people who need it. And I think what's critical about the Menu for Change report is that it highlights the link between poverty and food insecurity, both for those in work and for those out of work. And it rightly echoes the report on the UK by the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston. In his concluding remarks in Scotland, he outlined that incorporating the UN CRC into law was a key step in tackling poverty. And I think that's crucial. I hope we can all sign up to that in this chamber. But the challenge is turning that right into reality. And like others, I think there's so much more that the Scottish Government can do. Consistently use public procurement to deliver fair work and fair terms and conditions. Use public procurement to deliver quality, locally produced food. Supporting people who are furthest from the labour market back into work to give them the chance to work again and make sure they have decent employment. I want to add a final point. Colleagues have rightly highlighted the importance of eliminating poverty, but Angela Constance rightly mentioned the importance of community projects. And I cannot be alone in having spent a lot of time in the last few weeks out and about in our communities and looking at the reality of a lot of our communities. And we need more investment in our local authorities to enable them to deliver community-based projects, to empower people, give them access to community gardens and allotment projects, give them hope, give them connections with each other. It's important we don't just give people access to food, but we give them access to well-being, mental and physical health, and that needs to be part of our wider strategy to build communities, to build community empowerment, and to end food insecurity. There is so much more that can be done. That's why I think this debate is important tonight. There's a huge amount across the chamber where people have agreed with practical projects and investment that needs to come. And I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will take those comments and think about more what she and her colleagues can do right across the Scottish Government, not just in her own portfolio. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
I now call on Aileen Campbell to respond to the debate for around 7 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and like many of the speakers this evening, I thank Alec Rowley for bringing this debate to the Chamber and all the contributions that I've heard this evening. And it has been passionate, and that's right, because quite frankly it is an utterly shameful fact that in a country as rich as ours that folk should be hungry. And the testimonies that Alec Rowley read aloud that suggested that hunger was, people were getting kind of used to it, it is certainly not the kind of country that I want to be living in, and it's not the country that I want to be part of. And so I think collectively we must do more to tackle that and rid ourselves of that shame. But in particular, I want to thank the individuals who took part in the research and sharing their stories, and A Menu for Change for bringing their experiences to our attention. To end hunger in Scotland, as the report recommends, it is vital that we take action on the causes of poverty, and there are a number of recommendations for us in the Scottish Government, and we will of course continue to take the action needed and be guided by the recommendations of the report to tackle food insecurity and hunger. But as so many people have mentioned tonight, food poverty is down to income poverty and that lack of cash. And this has not been helped by the devastating cuts to welfare, because far from providing a safety net, the UK social security system is plunging many into crisis. 8,500 Scottish families have already had their income cut by the Universal Credit two-child limit. And that figure will reach 40,000 at full rollout, pushing up to 20,000 more children into poverty. Post-2015 welfare changes are set to reduce spending on social security in Scotland by an estimated £500 million a year. So these are devastating cuts, and we should be in no doubt about the impact that they are having, because in behind all those figures, all those statistics, are the stories of individuals who are struggling, who are surviving, not thriving, and of potential particularly in those children the numbers of children that I spoke about, which will represent potential unfulfilled unless we do more to try and support them. So we can't ignore that we can't ignore those statistics. So that is why last year we invested over £1.4 billion to support low-income households. And that includes over £100 million to mitigate UK government cuts. And this year, to increase household incomes, we announced the Scottish Child Payment. And that will put an extra £10 per week per child into the pockets of low-income families. It is a progressive policy and it will set to lift 30,000 children out of poverty. Also importantly, it will be a protective policy because it will ensure that people do not fall into poverty as well. So it is a crucial policy, and that's why charities have described it as a game changer, because it shifts the curve on child poverty in this country. And unlike the UK government, whose welfare reforms appear intentionally cruel and damaging, and as Elaine Smith said, a political choice, we believe that social security is an investment in the people of Scotland and has an important role to tackle poverty, with dignity, fairness and respect being the values underpinning our new agency, Social Security Scotland. Improving income from employment is also key to tackling poverty, and the research highlighted stories of people working on 0 hours contracts and the anxiety of not knowing where their next meal or their next paycheck was going to be coming from. So they were doing all that society asked of them. They were working hard, they were contributing, but they were never getting out of the bit and struggling, and that surely can't be right. And while the Scottish Government does not have the powers over employment law, we don't let that stop us taking action. That's why we seek to influence the agenda and use the powers that we do have to make a difference. Our new employment service, Fair Start Scotland, is helping those furthest away from the labour market into a good job that they can sustain. And our Fair Work Action Plan, published this year, supports employers to adopt fair work practices like payment of the real living wage and no inappropriate use of 0 hours contracts.
Alison Johnson.
The Cabinet Secretary's frustration at the policies that this Parliament requires to mitigate. But one thing I'd like to, perhaps Cabinet Secretary's coming on to it, but the Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Scottish Food Coalition want to see that right to food that's recognised in international law enshrined in Scots law. Is that something the Cabinet Secretary is considering presently?
Aileen Campbell.
So the First Minister's advisory group has been discussed as well at the meeting that Alison Johnson chaired very recently in the Parliament. The First Minister's advisory group will be looking at the totality of rights to make sure that we can take forward progress on that. But already, in lieu of that, we're taking a rights-based approach in the here and now to make sure that we can ensure that dignified access to food is the way that we approach this issue in Scotland. And the rights aspect of that is not lost, and that's why the First Minister's group is taking forward that work. So in terms of ensuring that we increase income from employment, we are proud that Scotland is the best performing part of the UK in terms of paying the real living wage, and we continue to work to lift at least 25,000 more people into the living wage by 2021 as part of that ambition to build a living wage nation. That's good progress, but there's clearly more to do, and is of little comfort to those who are currently on 0 hours contract that are currently struggling, but certainly we'll make sure that we continue to move forward and ensure that more people are paid the living wage. And alongside improving incomes from work and social security, our efforts to reduce household costs are significant to tackle poverty. For example, we know that low-income households often pay over the odds for energy. To address this, we're spending £500 million over 4 years to 2021 to tackle fuel poverty and improve energy efficiency. And we've also invested £3.3 million to deliver the Money Talk team service, and this supports low-income households to maximise their incomes by increasing benefit uptake and helping people make savings on essential services like household energy costs. And it's vital also that we focus our efforts on tackling these causes of poverty. However, when people do face a crisis, then we must ensure that support is easy to access and treats people with kindness and dignity. Our Scottish Welfare Fund is a unique source of crisis support in the UK, providing emergency cash to people in need. And many people have spoken about that this evening. Now, the principles of dignity and respect are already well embedded. The statutory guidance, which all local authorities must have regard to when delivering the Scottish Welfare Fund, states that at all times, local authorities must ensure applicants are treated with respect and their dignity is preserved. Crisis grants are currently paid by a variety of different methods, which allows for flexibility in local authorities being able to respond to individuals and local needs. And in November 2015, the Government and COSLA agreed a change to the way that the Scottish Welfare Fund was distributed amongst local authorities and to base it on the income domain of the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation to ensure that the fund helps the most deprived areas. And that change was phased in over a 3-year period, with 2018-19 being the first year fully using that SIMD model. So it's important that we allow the new funding methodology to bed down, and we will review in due course the impact of the new distribution method on local authorities. We also know that community spaces play an important role, and this research gives examples of the critical social and practical support provided by local initiatives like community cafes and community meals. They can provide safe spaces where people feel supported and included. All those issues around wellbeing, resilience, community empowerment that Sarah Boyack and others spoke about. And this is the sort of work that our £3.5 million Fair Food Fund supports. This fund helps communities to respond to food insecurities in ways that promotes dignity and can help people access wider support like welfare rights advice. It's a move away from the food banks that we all want to be rid of, and instead ensuring that dignity and choice and support is there for those who need it. Sarah Boyack also spoke about procurement as well, and I just want to highlight the work that's happening in North Ayrshire with the community wealth building model, which I think is a really important bit of work, and it's work that we want to support and have further supported across all the Ayrshires to ensure that community wealth building can be part of the regional deal that's happening there, to ensure that people can benefit from the investment that's happening there. So, conscious of time, Presiding Officer, I'm conscious that we've covered a lot. I'm conscious as well that this report isn't something that's just going to gather dust. This report has had and will have an impact on informing policy, and it's also having an impact in terms of a practical sense in the ways in which work is carrying out now in Dundee and Leavenmouth and Fife, ensuring that people get extra help as well as the response that they're getting to their food insecurity. So with Christmas just a few days away, a time of indulgence for many and enjoyment, we, I think, are reminded that for too many people this time of year can place real strain, sadness on for folk who are on very limited household budgets. So we must continue to work collaboratively to achieve our Sustainable Development Goal commitment to end hunger in Scotland. This is a key pillar of our Good Food Nation and Fairer Scotland ambitions. As a responsible human rights respecting country, we will continue to do everything in our power to make Scotland a fairer and more equal place for all. But it is challenging. It is challenging because what we have at the moment is an I'm all right Jack Tory government hell-bent on continuing to punish the most vulnerable. And we fight this poverty with one hand tied behind our back. Poverty doesn't have to be inevitable, as Angela Constance outlined. And we can't, in this government, in this parliament, just can't sit back and be content to accept poverty. Instead, we will continue to work across the parties, because I think most people in this place want to have a different kind of country, a different Scotland that doesn't have those testimonies that Alec Rowley read out at the start of the evening. We want something different. We want something better. We want a country that enables all of our people to have the life that they deserve and to be able to flourish in that.
That concludes the debate, and this meeting is closed.